Good morning, everybody. Well, as AJ mentioned to you earlier, this is that time of year where Jewish people celebrate the biblical feast known as the Festival of Tabernacles, Festival of Sukkot. And if you go through our courtyard, past that row of buildings over there, between that row of buildings and the gym, you will see a tabernacle that's made to traditional specifications for fellowship. So sometime during the week, if the office is open, which is most days during the week except Wednesday, you can actually have lunch or dinner in there. Just go knock on the door and say, hey, we want to use the tabernacle for fellowship. And I'll be there Wednesday night to enjoy that movie with whoever else shows up. It's kind of cool to do the things that God's people have been doing for thousands of years. And we're going to talk a little bit about tabernacles by extension, because another way to translate that word tabernacles or booth is tent. See, when the children of Israel left Egypt, when the children of Israel left Egypt, they didn't have any houses, and they lived out in the wilderness for 40 years. And they lived in tabernacles, the scripture says, or booths. Well, I find it hard to believe that they were schlepping around lumber and stuff to make little huts everywhere they went. They probably had a canvas little tent, something like Bedouin used to this very day. So the Festival of Tabernacles, the Festival of Tents, this is the week that that's honored. But we are in Genesis 23, and there's a connection that I'd never seen before. It's a slim one, but I'll point it out to you. In Genesis 23. In 23, sadly, Sarah, wife of the patriarch Abraham, dies. And so I was thinking about life and death while I was writing this lesson. And let me throw this out at you. If you had to write Sarah's epitaph, the thing that went on her tombstone, what would you write? You know, she was almost like the queen of Israel, if you know what I mean. The wife of Abraham, the father of nations. What would you say when somebody like that passes away? And then my sick sense of humor got the better of me, and I went online to look up some interesting epitaphs. True, but interesting epitaphs. And here's some of them that I found. You're all Tucsonans. You've probably seen this one before. From Tombstone. Here lies Lester Moore. 4 slugs from a 44. No less, no more. I can't even imagine carving that into somebody's tombstone. Here's another one. Underneath this pile of stones lies all that's left of Sally Jones. Her name was Briggs. It was not Jones. But Jones was used to rhyme with stones. I could just see a bunch of guys standing around burying this woman. Well, what can we say about her? I didn't like her. Did you like her? No, I didn't like her. We got to come up with something to say, though. It's her funeral. Can't speak ill of the dead. So they hired a poet. I don't know. How about this one? Here lies Jane Smith, wife of Thomas Smith, marble cutter. This monument was erected by her husband as a tribute to her memory. Isn't that nice? If it had just ended there. This monument was erected by her husband as a tribute to her memory and as a specimen of his work. Monuments of the same style, $350. True, real headstone. Here lies John Yeast. Pardon me for not rising. Here lies the body of Jonathan Blake. Stepped on the gas instead of the brake. And one of my favorite, Solomon Pease. Pease is not here, only the pod. Pease shelled out, went home to God. And not to be outdone, my all-time favorite, right after Pease on my list, here lies an atheist all dressed up and no place to go. So Genesis chapter 23, Sarah dies. At 127 years old, pretty old. You ever wish you could live longer? You know, the average lifespan for an American is 77.7 years. Interesting, 777. It's just the way it is right now. That means in the USA, when this statistic was taken just a couple years ago, 6,647 people die every day. 277 per hour, 4.6 per minute. That means every 15 seconds. For as long as it took me to read that, somebody in the United States died. Top 10 killers of Americans. Number 1, heart disease. Look at those numbers. 631,636 die a year of heart disease. Followed closely by cancer, 559,888. Then stroke, third on the list, 137,119. Chronic lower respiratory diseases, 124,583. Accidents of various sorts, 121,599. And then the numbers drop significantly. Diabetes, 72,449. Alzheimer's disease, I didn't know it was within the top 8, 72,432. And then influenza, cold, flu, pneumonia, 56,326. You know, life on this planet's rough. I saw this bumper sticker, life's hard, then you die. But none of us get out of here alive, right? I mean, we struggle, and eventually we get sick and die. That's the case for everybody. Sarah made it 127 years before she died. That's a long life. You know, back in the days of the patriarchs, they lived longer. But 127, just this year, the oldest person in the world died at 115. So between 115 and 127, not that big a spread. We're pretty much hitting life expectancies of the days of the patriarchs, which is very interesting, people 4,000 years ago. So it says Sarah, Abraham's wife, died, and she was buried in Hebron, or Hebron. In the Bible, in those days, Hebron was a Hittite town. How many of you have ever heard of the Hittites? Let me see your hands. Yeah, we studied about them in school. They're one of the oldest people groups in written history. And Abraham hung out with them. So in the Bible, we have one of the oldest human records of any people group. And Abraham lived there in a tent. But when Sarah died, they buried her in a cave. We've got a picture of where Hebron is. Go back. There we go. You see, it's not that far from Jerusalem, only a few miles. This was the promised land. But when Abraham and Sarah moved there, it still wasn't their land. It was going to be for their descendants, and they knew that. So when she died, Abraham went to this Hittite and said, "You've got a field here with some place I can bury my wife. Can I buy it from you?" And he said, "No, you're a mighty prince among us." He was wealthy. We've talked about how God used him to give him great influence and authority there. And they said, "You just pick any field you want and it's yours." And he said, "No, I insist on buying it." So they struck a deal and he bought it. Now that was 4,000 years ago. Her burial place is visited to this very day. Let's go back to that slide. That edifice right there was built by Herod. Herod the Great, the same Herod that lived during the days that Jesus was a baby, the one that tried to kill all the babies. He built that. He had Jewish heritage, and I imagine he wanted to honor the burial place of the patriarchs. So to this very day, 4,000 years later, you can go to Hebron, which is now the biggest city in the West Bank, and you can visit the tomb of the patriarchs where Sarah and Abraham are buried. Those other pictures, by the way, are the inside view of some of the sarcophagi, some of the burial chambers. Whether their real bones are still in there after all the years, I have no clue. I doubt it. But that is the location. And it's one of the oldest locations on the planet that you can historically track to a biblical event 4,000 years ago. It's amazing. So Sarah, she and Abraham started off in a city called Ur of the Chaldees. They lived in a city, so they obviously lived in a house. God called them to move to the promised land. They gave up their house and moved into a tent. And they spent the rest of their lives in a tent. And then she dies. She gets buried in a field, in a cave, in a field, in a tomb. From city and house to tent to tomb. That doesn't look like the progression most of us want to take. Maybe tent to house, but not house to tent. And here's the thing, the Hebron of those days, the Hittite Hebron is gone. There's a new Hebron there. Their tent, gone. Grave, still there.